Hello, everybody. Hopefully, glad to see y'all coming back for another installment of our webinar series here. We're talking about the requirements today for your business and what you need to do to help determine if you're meeting requirements in doing your cyber protection of your business. In the previous one, we did some education on what's going on in the market and things of that nature. And now we're transitioning into to kind of give you a sense about what you need to be looking at for requirements, develop those requirements, where are the requirements coming from, and show you where you have to go look and what you're actually tying to. And again, today I got Mr. Mark Sangster with me. How you doing, Mark?
Very well, Wayne. It's great to be back here for part two.
Yeah, sounds great. So let's kind of dive into it here. So in here, and as we said, this is the second one where we're going into those requirements that you need to meet for your business, and this is going to lead into next week and taking those requirements and how you actually solve the problems, how you actually start doing things. So when we look at this, all talking about requirements, we're really talking about risk factors. And the risk factors helps determine what the requirements is we need in our business, whether you're in finance market, whether you're in healthcare, what it may be, they're different ones. So you have to identify your accountability, your exposures, your adversaries. And coming through this, Mark, I deal mostly in the finance. I'm doing CMMC now,
Right.
which even in with HIPAA, there's a lot of these requirements that are the same regardless of the industry. But then you got to find the industry specifics that you need to dive into that are the above the common set.
Yeah, that's very true, right? So if we were to, kind of boil it down, what you'd find is generally the controls across different industries when it comes to security and compliance are kind of the same, right? Maybe there's not
Mm-hmm.
100% overlap, but the Venn diagram's pretty tight. But yes, there are specific things that they look for. The way that they look for reporting is different. I'll give you an example, right? Credit unions have other aspects that might get added into that, like how many assets are in the vault and how is it invested and what are they invested in and so on, right? Which is not the same as what you'd see in healthcare with patient reporting and not the same as what you'd see with the FFIEC example with small banking, right? So it
Mm-hmm.
always varies. And I think it's important when you think about your risk. Your risk is not just the compliance component, right? Like you've got the sophisticated adversaries. We talked about that last week. Although I will note that this morning we saw the announcement from the FBI that in a collective campaign they were able to take down a very active ransomware group called Hive. Right, they took
Mm-hmm.
over their leak site, and which is interesting. Of course, they claimed that they've prevented the payout of 130 million in ransoms. We'll see. I mean, that gang had collected about 100 million over the last year or so, but it's good to see that. But that's rare, right? Don't take that as the sort of the common thing. The reality is often these guys work with impunity, but there's also the exposures too, right? That you bring into this. So we talked about banking or healthcare. So what are those exposures? They're probably the core technologies that you use, and then also the obligations that come along with those. And of course, that closes the loop, right? Takes us right back to compliance and regulators.
Exactly. And the hottest thing's been going on, and where I typically like to start in defining requirements is first thing I talk with a client that says, okay, let me see your cyber insurance policy, because those base policies,
Mhm.
not the riders, because the riders really don't have much in them. And if you got a rider, you really need to talk with a broker and really go into it, because the riders are basically not worth the paper they're written on these days. But the cyber insurance policies, I go get them right off the bat to say, okay, what are the requirements that are written into that policy? And I find a lot of clients don't realize that when they sign that policy, there's actually detailed requirements in there that you need to have in place. And the reason why that's important, even if it's the basic five, MFA,
Yeah.
firewall, patching, immutable backup, offsite,
Yeah.
those things. If you sign that, then you should have those in place, because when you actually go to the insurance company and come in and say, okay, we had an event, we need to apply the insurance. That's the first thing you're going to ask you. Do you show me that you got these requirements met? Prove it. And if you don't, right off the bat, you're behind the eight ball, because I'm seeing
Yeah.
them not actually pay out, not help any, because you didn't meet the requirements. So that's the first place I start looking for a customer is those requirements.
Yeah, I think insurance has become a lot more complicated, right? If you think back
Yes,
to that first webinar that we did last week, where we showed you all the things that go on in your environment. So when you say there were no signs for an attack, there were plenty. And when that insurer brings in what they call a paneled vendor, so that means there's sort of a pre-approved vendor for incident response, like doing the forensics
right,
or legal coaching, counseling. It could be a broker to pay ransomware and whatever cryptocurrency for you, crisis communications. They're all coming in. The reason that the insurer picks them is they kind of represent the insurer to some degree. So that forensics team is going to find all that stuff. And yes, like you're saying, Wayne, the first thing they're going to look at is, if you said you do 1 to 5, can you, prove what we call duty of defense? Can you
right.
demonstrate that you were using those, that your policies met them, that you adhere to those policies? So like if you have MFA, for example, you don't have all these other cases where, MFA is voluntary, right? And if someone, wants to take the time, they do it. But, if they don't, well, so be it. And typically we often see that's the top level, right? That's the execs, the managing partners, and so on, who say, well, I'm too busy for that, that nonsense, having to do that on my phone. And that's what's going to hurt you. And in fact, now even in the due diligence stage of getting coverage, it went from a kind of like, well, tell us what you've got and we're going to put that in the paper, to now they're using far more strict scrutiny, like proper due diligence, like a major investor, like an institutional investor or a bank would have approached their vendors. So they're up in the game. And of course, that makes it a lot harder for small to medium sized businesses that, don't have the resources of a major bank, to be able to go
Mhm.
through that, go through that mechanism, fill out all the documentation. I had one company talk about, they're going down the list going, yes, no, yes, no. And I'm like, if you're answering this, yes, no, they're all no's, right? Because it's not that simple.
Well, the other thing with this, when it comes like the MFA, and you'll have the execs, you'll have people. I don't want to have to do that. Well, typically the IT team would go put MFA for themselves, but then wouldn't deal with management. Go have that fight, saying no, we have to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you have MFA installed? You have to. You're not meeting that requirement. Yeah, you got installed on maybe 5 people,
That's right.
but that doesn't meet the requirement. If you got to have MFA on the whole company,
Yeah,
or it's not met,
that's right.
at all. And there's a lot of people would go and they'd get it on 1 or 2 people and then say, check the box, yes.
That's exactly it.
That won't fly no more.
Yeah, that's right. And documenting it, right? It's got to be whatever you want to call it, whether it's documenting, like you have a report or you have some way of proving it, you're going to have to
Hmm.
do that, right?
Yep,
Through
exactly.
logs and so on. Otherwise, you're right. I mean, even right down to security awareness training, we provide training. Okay. So show us, who took what, when, and how frequently, and what some of the scores or measures were for that, right? And it's become more open-ended. Isn't a show us their click rate or show us their surrender rates. It's show us what you have. And it's almost like, the expression about, give somebody enough rope and they'll hang themselves. And that's kind of what they're
Yeah,
looking for, right? They
yeah,
they
exactly.
know, versus the being very prescriptive and you trying to check a box. They're trying to prevent that, right? They're trying to set an aspirational goal and then seeing whether or not you can meet it. And they're not really going to tell you what the measure is, and it's tougher. And of course, they're doing this because, as you can see on this chart, right, over the last few years, they have been losing money. Almost 3/4 of every a coverage policy that they have lost money when there was a claim made against it, right? And they we all know how insurance and big banking works, right? They're the house, and the house always wins. So at some point, they're gonna, they're starting to change, and that's what we're seeing, and that's why they're sort of clamping down. I'd say the early, days of the wild west, right, where there wasn't the actuarial kind of information that you have in other forms of coverage like life and auto and home.
Mhm.
We're still not there, but I can tell you what they are seeing is they know what the actual costs look like in this. They know what the damage is to them and to the economy in general. And so they're starting to realize this isn't a, hey, get an agent out there just to, sign a policy and, we'll worry about it. If it's now very much, in lieu of actuarial data, they're drilling down and they are trying to minimize their risk because those payouts have been painful.
Right. And so for anybody out there, if you got questions, go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll work it in. We won't wait to the end. So feel free to ask questions. So what I do from a requirement standpoint on this is we actually do the free policy assessments. And so we have that. We work with a pure cybersecurity broker. They don't do nothing else but cybersecurity. And we give free audits, look at what those things are. And that's one of the things that you should make a requirement. You should have that reviewed. And so you can determine what's in there. Because what you're also finding is a requirement is finding an insurance broker that specializes in cyber insurance, because most brokers don't. They don't really understand it. So you really got to do your research. So one of your requirements is to really, what do I have? What have I already signed up for? And is this policy a good policy? Do I need to look at it? And there's about 40 underwriters that really specialize in that area.
Yeah.
That can go and really take a good look at that. So that I always make that one of the requirements. Where am I sitting today from a cyber insurance standpoint?
Yeah. And don't think about it as a top number, right? You got to think about it
Right.
as just like auto insurance. You're going to have the cost of repairing your vehicle, the cost of repairing another party's vehicle, healthcare costs, and getting a rental car during when it's getting fixed, all that kind of stuff. Same thing here. You can't just say I have 2 million or 5 million in insurance, because that might be to do things like replace damaged systems, to do the work with those vendors like an IR forensics firm, crisis comms, communicating to your customers, etc. It doesn't mean if you've got 5 million in coverage, 5 million is going back in your bank to pay that $5 million ransom. It's covering all sorts of other expenses as well. So you really have to understand what that looks like.
Yeah, that's a interesting piece, because in all the audits we've done, we find probably about 70% of the policies are undersized.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You'd be surprised. And coming in, another one of the requirements that we really look at is, this goes into your instant response side of the house, is how things are going to be done. What are my requirements in looking at payouts? Because there's some ways, if you had to do that, there's a very specific requirements on how you go about it and deal with that. And there's a lot of instances like we're showing now of where people actually get in trouble because they didn't do it right.
Absolutely. So when we pivot from insurance, we can we can segue, I should say, into this matter, which is when you pay a ransom, the U.S. Department of Treasury came out and made two statements a year or so ago now, which they're still holding, and we're starting to see some of that come to fruition with criminal prosecution. Is they're reminding that, one, paying a ransom is illegal, right? It is a criminal activity. In some cases, you may be violating federal law, like trading with the enemy.
Yep.
Or the Anti-Terrorism Act. And so, they're not going to say to a, community hospital, excuse me, they're not going to say to a community hospital that's been shut down, hey, tough luck. And, by the way, we're going to, charge you. They're trying.
Okay. I think we lost Mark. Mark will be coming right back in. You just lock it. There you go.
Oh, we're back. Something happened there.
There you back. Yeah.
Yeah. I was gonna say, so there's two things you need to do. One, you need to be able to file a suspicious activity report. That means, just like a bank, you've got to say, look, I had to do this thing. It's not a normal financial transaction. You need to know about it. You got to provide those details. The second thing you have to do is make sure that you can pay it. And so there's a thing called the OFAC list, right? The Office of Foreign Assets Control. And you literally have to go in and kind of search it and figure out, is there an individual, a ransomware gang, a country, a company, whatever it is that I'm allowed to pay. And if I transact with them, then, that may break federal law, like I said. And again, yes, in many cases, it's going to. Conti, Black Basta, Hive, all these gangs, they're listed in the OFAC's list. So working with the insurer, working with your incident response firm and law enforcement potentially kind of helps you clear that barrier, because that's one of the things they said is like, look, if you do all of this work, if you don't try to do it on your own, we're going to take a kind view of it, because we understand you may have been in between a rock and a hard place. So we don't want to, punish the victim, but you got to check your homework, right? You got to do this. You can't just go, hey, look, I'm desperate to get back to business. I've got enough money in the bank. I'm going to stroke a check.
And there's a reason why we pulling out some of these obscure requirements because they're the standard requirements from IT and stuff like that. I know I got to do password rotations, I got to do patching, I got to do those things. Everybody knows that. Reason I wanted to focus on some of these pieces, the main requirements we're looking throughout this for everybody is these are ones nobody talks about. And until it's time I have to do it, and they're going, I didn't realize I had to do these things because they are kind of obscure. Plus, it's changing so fast. These reporting requirements are changing every day, just like the FTC one, right? So
Exactly.
it's one of these things where you get into it, and these reporting and the time windows have been changing. And this is all over probably what the last 12 months. It's really getting tighter, and they're putting teeth to it. If you don't do this, because it is long, then you're going to pay the penalty for it. So I think these are the things I really would like to make sure that customers know about and get into their IRP plan ahead of time.
Yeah, that's a
Make
great
sure the
point, Rick.
information is correct, exactly who's doing it, and the time frame requirements.
Yeah, that's it. And we're just seeing this get tighter and tighter, right?
Yeah.
So at the federal level, for example, right, the Cyber Incident Reporting on for Critical Infrastructure Act, and
Mm-hmm.
that's through CISA, which is the public arm of DHS, Homeland
Right.
Security, right, is starting to push this down and kind of say, look, when these things happen, you guys, you have to report this, and you have to report it in 72 hours. If you make a ransom payment, you have to report it within 24 hours, and they're starting to mirror, ironically, I would say, that privacy legislation, things like
Yeah.
CCPA in California or GDPR in
Mm-hmm.
Europe, they're starting to mirror that, right? Where they're starting to say, look, this whole, in a reasonable time from discovery, that's legal, no man's land, right? It's too gray. We're going to start to say the golden hour here is 72. And that's a good standard. Once you really know what's going on, it gets you enough time to sort of get an idea, get a handle, take a breath, right? And then start to react. And so you've got to be able to do that. And we're also seeing, even at the state level, that numerous states are putting in not just reporting requirements, but they are effectively making it illegal for any public entity or any entity that is public by a funded trust or service cannot pay it, right? So they're trying to knock out educational institutions, healthcare facilities, municipalities, and so on. And this is just going to continue. And the reason they're doing this is it's a bit of a strong-armed way of saying, look, ransomware is an economic model of supply and demand. It's a twisted version of that, but effectively they're forcing you into paying. And so what if we break one side of that? What if we make it so, like, hey, even as a victim, you just simply can't pay? They're hoping that the criminals will go away, or they'll pivot and they'll find something else to do.
Well, and that's where it comes in, and having the plans, especially a lot of folks are saying about their backups, and they ask the question a lot about the immutable backups and the pieces that to where you have that
Right.
data can't be changed because, like you were saying before about paying the ransom, and I've seen customers that said we can't be down. I'm gonna go ahead and pay it. We'll deal with the rest later. The problem with that is now the teeth they've added to that, and even I just read an article this morning, 2023. One of the biggest things that the Department of Justice is focusing on is the Data and Privacy Act and what they're going to be tightening in that about what you can and can't do and what you should be doing into there. So that's a big focus for the DOJ this year. So
Yeah, agreed.
we're going to have more changes, just like what we expected, right?
It's going
So
to constantly change, constantly adapt,
yeah,
which
exactly.
is
So you
which is
really
why,
got to know what you're doing there.
yeah, you really got to keep up with the risk assessments here, right? So it's not just, when I talk about a risk assessment, this isn't just looking at the assets you have and the controls and vulnerabilities, but I mean, what are your obligations, right? And that means working with your legal team. Kind of, building on what Wayne's saying here. This isn't something you do once a year or every 5 years and go, we probably should update this plan because it's got a lot of dust on it, and it doesn't mention cloud, or it doesn't mention Office 365 or IoT, and we have those things now. Unfortunately, the frequency of change is far more rapid.
You give a good story. Some of this stuff that we're talking about here associated to the travel X, and won't you share that story that you told me about this?
Yeah, so TravelX is a non-existent company now, but back at sort of at the beginning of COVID, I guess, when all that pandemic started, TravelX was hit over, actually, in 2019, I think, by a ransomware gang, and they were shut down. And for almost 3 months, they kind of pretended that this was maintenance. So every time you went onto their
Mhm.
website and you tried to, you tried to do something like, change U.S. currency to euros or whatever it would be, they would just tell you, "I'm sorry, that service is unavailable. We're just doing maintenance. Check back soon." And they continually denied it, even when leaks and reports started coming out saying, "Look, the reality is here, this isn't maintenance. We've been attacked and we've been shut down. We're at the mercy of an external third party who is trying to do us harm." And eventually this all blew up, and Travelex, now they blamed COVID, but a lot of other travel industries like airlines and hotels seem to survive just fine. Well, okay, a little scathed, but whatever, doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. These guys, they disappeared, and they did blame this security attack. And the big thing that came out of this is they lied. They continually lied about it. And in the UK, where they were based, there's the ICO, which is the Information Commissioner's Office, which is like a federal level privacy organization. And they came in and they started investigating, and it showed how poorly they tried to manage it. They stuck their head in the sand and pretended it wasn't happening. They tried to deceive the public. And unfortunately, I just call this as like you're kicking the can down the road, right? Eventually it's going to come out. And the longer it takes, the worse it's going to be. And frankly, if you just back up and you go, write the narrative, because when you look at what happens with media, when you look at what happens with public opinion, if you can try to set the narrative and drive it, it's far better than sitting back and letting somebody else write your story, particularly when the story they're writing is true and the one you're telling is false.
Right.
Eventually you're going to get busted.
Well, and this goes, a lot of people worry, oh, if I get hacked, I'm going to lose credibility. And actually, that's what really happened here. One, they committed fraud because based on law of reporting, but
That's
they
right.
also, reason they're out of business is because they lost the trust of their customers,
Yeah,
the community, all that,
that's right.
because they deceived. I've seen other companies get hacked. They turned right around, reported it. They went to their employees and all that. Then they turned around to the FBI and then actually made public statements there. And those companies are thriving
That's right.
because they're trusted that they're going to do the right thing if something happens to protect us, protect
Yeah.
my information, do
Yeah.
those things. So that's one of the things I try to describe to you. Don't be afraid. Do it. It's kind of like I use that one analogy. I use the snowball analogy. I'm up on top of the hill and I got a snowball in my hand. I can manipulate it and take care of it and make it go away. But
Yeah.
if I say no and you kick the can, like you said, and I just throw it down, by the time it gets to the bottom of the hill, it's huge. And I can't do nothing about it. Right.
Yeah. That's right.
So follow that process in the timelines. And there's timelines for it. So you figure out what those timelines are, set those requirements, make sure you're meeting those. So it's just that really comes back. And so the other things about when we talk all this deceptive practices here, and we talk that reporting, and what are you doing here? You're not telling the truth, or those things. There's actually that, like the
Mhm.
FTC, there's guidelines that you got to follow, and they'll talk about this and what they're going to dive into. And this is even getting more teeth now than it had a year ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So, back again, sort of 2 years ago, remember when, we all started working remotely, video conferencing tools, Zoom in particular, just went through the roof, right? I think they went from
Mm-hmm.
like 10 million users to like 300 million users in, a matter of months. And unfortunately, of course, as soon as you become big, criminals go after you, right?
Yep.
And that's exactly what happened. And it turned out there were issues. And of course, they denied it. They wrote white papers about it. Their CEO wrote blogs going, guys, we're really secure. These are all the things we've done. The unfortunate thing was it's what I would call marketeering, which I mean is the marketing team was out ahead selling aspirationally what the company was attempting to get to. So the technical people hadn't quite got there. So the things they were promising about encryption and protection and so on weren't in place. They were going to be. They were selling futures. And as a public company, that's a bad idea. That tends to be illegal, right? And so the FTC investigated them, and their own information, right? Those blog posts, those white papers
Yep.
that the CEO wrote, that was the evidence
Yep.
introduced in this investigation to burn them, right? They didn't need third parties or a leak or, a whistleblower to do it. Now they settled. But since then, we've also seen other companies coming out. So that's sort of the macro sort of issue. But at the micro level, the SEC has been finding companies on the regular because they get hit And then they say things like, all the tropes, right? Well, we caught it quickly and there wasn't a lot of damage. Well, it turns out when you're talking caught it quickly means they were in your, dwelling in your network for 7 months and you didn't know about it. And there were, very little damages. Well, it turns out they stole millions of dollars or we paid this $5 million ransom, right? And they don't confess that. Well, now the SEC and the FTC are saying that's not good enough. You need to give real details. You need to say, on January 1, this happened. On January 10, we did this. On the 15th, we did that, and spell it out, not using these kind of broad terms and trying to put that softer spin on it to make it sound like it wasn't so bad. Because the people who were impacted, they know how bad it was. And I'm glad they're doing that, right? Because again, you're just better to ride it, accept the cards you got dealt, and do your best to play those cards rather than pretend that you have aces up your sleeve, especially when you don't.
So from this, I show this, and then I have people say, well, what's the requirement you're telling me here? And the important piece about this, you talked about what the IT team was doing, what the marketing team was doing. Well, and part of your requirements that's flowing into this, you got to make sure every group within your organization understands and have a playbook, the requirements of what they have to do as part of this process. So you don't get into this scenario because
Yep.
everybody has to report a certain way, and there's got to be, as an old military guy, a chain of command. And you go do this. What
Yep.
are their requirements? So when you say, okay, we've had an incident, you pull out your playbook. What's my requirements? What am I supposed to do? And what am I supposed to get? And who am I supposed to talk to?
Yep.
And do that and make sure everyone's doing that. So you got to lay those requirements out to everybody in the company, from the janitor to the CEO, and make sure they all understand what that is.
Yeah, that's team alignment, right? That's
Right.
important. And one company that I worked with that had been shut down by Conti, they made those kind of mistakes, right? The CEO didn't want to pay for multiple years of credit checks for people who were affected. He thought one would suffice. Didn't want to listen to his lawyer, and of course they got busted for that. And their marketing people put out a notification that tried to describe the type of information that had been affected, and said, look, this is no different than the information that's on a check you might write. And it's like,
Mhm.
well, that's a whole lot different. I volunteered that check. It's used in a specific context. There are other protections around how that gets used to prevent fraud. What's happening here? This is like you dropped my credit cards on the ground. You spilled this stuff out. There's a huge difference. And of course, what happened? There was massive backlash when you try to write something like that to tone it down. And all you're now doing is you're offending those who have been affected. They don't want to work with you anymore. They have no sympathy. Now they're just angry and they're looking for some form of retribution, not as vengeance, just to make themselves whole.
Mhm. And coming out of that, and we talked about the requirements about, making sure everybody knows their place and what they need to do. One of the big requirements of doing that is making sure how you're going to communicate. Because earlier, a couple of years ago, we were always told, call your lawyer first,
Mm-hmm.
have your conversation, and then have the lawyer communicate for you so you have attorney client privilege on things as you need to. Well, what we're finding out is, well, typically that's true, but in a ransomware attack, and depending on that, because it could be nation state, it could be, you know, you know, uh, uh, terrorist, and how it gets treated in the laws now. Now that in forensics reports, and specifically doing the forensics analysis, that
Mm-hmm.
actually pierces that attorney-client privilege now, and you got to be aware of that. And so that's one of those other really important requirements is how are we communicating, making sure we're telling them what we need to tell them and doing in the right way to also protect intellectual property things and stuff like that, but still not violate the Reporting Act at the same time. So you got to do some homework there.
Yeah, agreed. And there's also complexity around things like budgeting, contracting, and so on. So the base assumption in what you're talking about was, of course, that attorney-client privilege would apply and protect all information when the attorney was the one that engaged the incident response firm, as an example. Well, often
Mm-hmm.
it's an insurer bringing them in, so your attorney might work with them, but you didn't engage them. And also, the courts have narrowed that definition to say,
Yep.
look, attorney-client privilege is actually only supposed to relate to information directly involved in the attorney supporting the client with the best legal representation they can. Not everything, right? So you can't just send every doc to your lawyer and go, "Ah, because my lawyer manages it, nothing I've ever done is discoverable," right? That is never been protected and is ridiculous. Well, the same applies here, and I think that's what companies are getting away with. But in the budgeting too, the other things that have happened here, like with Capital One, was that the way the budget was allocated, it didn't go to the legal department. It actually went to IT. In fact, it went to a bucket that said you can't cut this stuff because Capital One was going through reductions at the time. And it was part of a larger contract where they had other security services being provided by the vendor. And so the judge looked at it and went, "Look, you hired, or your lawyer, sorry, hired this firm like 10 years ago, long before this incident happened. How can you possibly argue that the documentation and the other products that have been created in this have something to do, with, you could have never predicted this 10 years ago." So that's where it all broke down. So it's important now to understand how you have to set that up legally, what kind of terms and verbiage has to be in the contract so that you can protect as much as as you're able to. But know at the end of the day, things like communication, Slack messages, Teams records, files, emails, etc., they can be discoverable, right? So
Mhm.
this can go back to like when you don't want somebody in IT to go, "Oh my gosh, I just discovered something bad. We've had an incident." Well, an incident is a legal term. A breach is a legal term. An event, is not, right? So you got to be real
Right.
careful because otherwise that might start a trigger, right? Because, internally you've acknowledged that something significant has happened that may trigger some kind of notification. But the reality is that's not what happened, right? You weren't there yet. You didn't know if that were the case. And that can change the dates. And then that can, back to our regulator issues, insurance coverage, et cetera. You really got to watch what you're doing nowadays.
Yeah. So making sure in that plan what you're doing there, make sure you get that communication process and how you're doing that information in your contracts and those things. So now we've talked about this, and there's paying ransom. Does it always lead to a faster recovery? No. We all know that paying the ransom doesn't necessarily mean, because they could say, "Oh, here you go," they unlock it and turn right around and they can hammer you again. So one of the things is we always get told is you don't pay. There's other things you go do. There's things requirements you put in place that actually you spend better time on, that actually can help you do your faster recovery. So those requirements coming into about how you're protecting your data, where you got the copies at, do you have immutable storage? Do I have the process to do it? What are those things? And these 10 items, when you really come into this, and I love your title on this, is a deal with the devil better than no deal at all. Um, when I think about that, is personally myself, I want to have my own plan and come in that and have, I know I've got data there. And yes, it may be painful to do the recovery and leave the forensics side alone so we can so the FBI can hunt. Yes, that's budget you plan for and what you go do. But that's also where you set those requirements. To me, this whole thing goes to the requirements of what do I have to have in this situation to transact business
Yeah.
with my clients and take care of my clients. What is that minimum subset? Not all everything, but what is the minimum? Define those requirements from a business standpoint, not a technical standpoint. You know, how am I going to invoice? How am I going to collect money?
Yeah.
How am I going to communicate? You know, those to me are the things you go off and do and you figure out. And then you work the others as you can and lay those requirements out. Now, once I have those business requirements, now I can set up what I got to do technically to make that happen. And that actually builds out the IRP right there for
Right.
you. Okay.
Right.
To me, that's the plan. That's the devil I want to deal with. Budget. I'd rather deal with that devil than the devil I have no control over.
Yeah. And talking about prioritization, this is just like you would do in any other disastery,
Yeah.
recovery scenario, right? You'd say, okay, what are
Mm-hmm.
the core things I need back? Like you said, whatever the core systems are to provide service to my customer base, how do I bill them and invoice them? HR, maybe some marketing tools, things like that. Okay, they can come later, right? And so you prioritize out the key systems that you need to get back up and running. And if you really want a proof on that one, think about the dark side attack on the Colonial Pipeline last
Exactly.
year, right?
Yep.
They didn't take down the pipeline; they took down the billing system, and that's
Exactly.
so they couldn't track where the petroleum products were going, and they couldn't bill for them. That's why service stopped, not because of a physical blockage or a lack of control in a pipeline to actually get product to the distributors and to the consumers. So that's why this is really important to understand.
Mhm. And I talk with a lot of folks and they come into it and they want to get the whole business back up. And that can take a lot longer. And they actually create time barriers for themselves in doing it. So that's one of those things that comes in. What are my pieces? I mean, we did that for us. I know the minimum subset I got to have and how I can get it back up. We can transact. You know, my sales system, my marketing system. If I can't invoice and collect, those are useless.
Yeah.
And I can pick up a phone and talk to the customers and do what we need to do there. So that's the big one that you come into. And you're looking like a bank coming into there. Do I need all my ATMs up? No.
That's right.
I need to be able to transact in the bank first.
Yep. Yep.
Then get branches next. Then all the what I call creatures of comfort for the customer, having ATMs, different places, stuff like that. That's what I'll go deal with next. So that's just an example of what you might do there compared to what the hospital.
Right.
I got to have critical care units up quick. I got to have emergency room up quick. What other things do I kind of prioritize later? Every one of our businesses has it, and it's all got to be based on how do I take care of my client, from their perspective. So this is a team where you get your team to sit down. I did another presentation, and we kind of laid it out about, okay, sit down in your room, take your IRP plan out, go through it, and if you find a hole, just jot it down, keep going. Go all the way to the end, then come back to it and patch those holes. Because if you're not doing that, I guarantee you it's like Swiss cheese because things change too fast.
Yeah.
So setting requirements isn't a one-time thing. This has a life and it's got to evolve. So you always got to be reviewing and doing this. Keeping up with the actual, one of the requirements is always have someone review what's the law changes, what's going on with it, how does that affect the requirements I've got. So I wish it was one of those things you could say, I can set my requirements and I'm good.
Yeah.
That don't work.
Yeah, it's not set and forget. And the other part of this too is that you could pay the ransom. And again, I can go back to an example of a manufacturer. If you let your IT get too far out of policy, let's put it this way, or your sort of the technology you have is legacy, often what you find is after a ransomware attack, you've got to rebuild. And then when you go to rebuild, you find that the new tech will not talk to the old tech that's no longer supported. And so that becomes an even bigger problem because you're sort of trapped where you have critical information and services in a legacy technology base that you can't use anymore. And now you got to start from scratch. You got to figure out how to how you're going to export it and re-import it, and it gets a lot more painful. So yeah, you may have those XP servers kicking around or whatever they are, Windows 7, and you think that does fine for your business. This is a reason these companies like Microsoft stops supporting them. You just get out too far out of band and they can't keep up. And think about the companies that are coming in, the experts, the tools that they're going to bring. You want them to work with your stuff too, and not get to the point where they show up and you're on paper and quill for your records, right? They, in a lot of cases, they can't pull forensics from that. There's less information they can get, and so on. And right, so it doesn't pay. You kind of got to at least be somewhere in the middle when it comes to adopting technology, because you get too far behind the pack, and it's easy for those predators to cut you off and do a lot of damage.
Yeah. We've been talking about all these requirements internally for ourselves, right? For the client, what they got to be doing here. But in our world today, it's a B2B world, right? We transact business with others and vendors and doing all this. And I've had clients say, okay, we got our environment solid. We got our plan, we got this, we got a review, we're doing all that. Then I say, okay, well, what about your vendor requirements? What do you mean? Well, what are your requirements to your vendors, and how do they prove they're meeting those requirements? Because that's part of your ecosystem. And if you're doing electronic transfer with a business, your security piece, your policies have to apply to them.
Yeah.
You got to tell them what they are and them give you some way of proving they've done it. Because I'm going to ask you about that, because that's a hole into the environment from an IT perspective.
Yeah.
If I can't verify that that's being done correctly, then I have an issue there. And a prime example, if you're a bank and you deal with the Federal Reserve, you have your Fed line. And this is transaction moving money, right? Well, the bank's got their piece, but that one specific system that interfaces to the Federal Reserve, if it's not meeting those setting controls, then you're out of compliance. And you got to be aware of those things. So in your business, whoever you are, those are other requirements you got to look at. And that can be a struggle. I mean, what have you experienced with folks, and how some of the ways that you go approach those type of things getting from the vendors? Because that can be a little difficult at times.
Yeah, it can, right? I kind of put it in the three P's: policies, protections, and promises, right? Your third party risk. And I think a lot of companies forget, of course, that, it's your brand, it's your reputation. The customer, the market, public doesn't care that you subcontracted out your billing or your PCI management for credit cards or whatever it is to some other company. And we've seen that time and time again in healthcare, in finance, in manufacturing, et cetera. So you ultimately, if you're the top of the pyramid, you're responsible. Now, what Wayne's talking about here is, you're right. There are often challenges. And the way I put this is, you're never going to prove that a super small company is secure, right? A small little vendor that's, writing some code for you or whatever it is, right? That's tough because, again, they don't have the resources of a big company. That said, on a big company side, like a Microsoft and Amazon and so on, yeah, good luck getting them to fill out due diligence questionnaires around security, unless you yourself are another, mega player in the Fortune 100 that, you can sumo wrestle on your weight, and they're willing to do that for you. So it really is, though, kind of determining what they have and what they're capable of, and then mapping that back to what you have to do, right? So again, if you want to work with that, app development company or a data storage company or whatever they're doing, right? That's great. Just understand what their capabilities are and what your requirements are. And realistically, most of those companies should be able to meet your requirements. And if they can't, then you've got to make sure that you do that. And that's why it's down to like doing the due diligence, even if it's more light, it's not a 600 questionnaire, and figuring that stuff out, but also working through the incident response plan with them. So understanding, look, if something happens, when do I need you to tell me, right? I need you to be upfront. What information am I going to need from you when that occurs? And when you're working on how these things work, is to figure that out, right? To test it, to work collaboratively, to understand, how am I going to transfer this information? How do we communicate? Who's going to do what? Right. So when we figure out, here's the 5 things we got to do to respond, what's that division of duty? And that's where I think you just got to look at it as a partnership and a collective, an ecosystem, rather than kind of blindly assuming that somebody's doing this for you when they're not. And a real good example of this one is often with, certain applications or something where you didn't pay the maintenance fee. So you bought it and you dropped it into your environment, but you didn't want to pay for the updates and have somebody do that for you. And then you assume that they're still doing it. Meanwhile, they're like, well, you didn't buy that service, so we're not. And we saw that time and time again with like Cisco, Fortinet, Citrix, all of these, where companies weren't working with someone like an AvTek who's capable of doing that stuff, right? And doing it for you. And then they suddenly turn around and go, oh, crap, I thought you were doing it. It's a bit like the ball falling between the two receivers, because, each one thought the other person had it. And, that's where you just got to make sure you sew that stuff up. Again, that's an insurance nightmare. That's where they're going to look at that sort of thing. And it's tough. And even as the vendor, I can say this too, that, when you come under scrutiny, you yourself have to, prove your duty of defense. And that manufacturer I mentioned that got attacked, they're like, well, they had some big name companies that they worked with. And they're like, oh, they were really sympathetic. I'm like, I'm sure they were, until their lawyers got involved. And then of course, within 6 months to a year, they started losing those contracts because either A, they couldn't provide the level of security that those big companies needed, or B, the liability that they had to take on as the big company through insurance coverage and so on, they just weren't willing to do, right? They're like, go find me somebody else who hasn't had a major breach. There's got to be other people who supply this. And that's exactly what happened.
And two things that you mentioned there. One, when it comes to like the support and more maintenance and for the patching, stuff like this, even for most of those vendors, when you pay for that, they provide it to you, but they don't do it for you. So
That's
just
right.
because you've got that, you yourself still own the requirement and the due diligence to make sure patching is being done. Your internal IT team, your MSP that's doing it for you, and that needs to be fine, because if you got an MSP like me, first thing I'm going to tell you if we're going to get together is we have what's called shared responsibility. And that's by law in an article by Congress last year. It's a shared responsibility. So if I'm going to do this, I require you to have support on all your hardware and software so I can get the patches, so I can do my best effort of keeping that stuff patched in that, so I meet my shared responsibility, because that's putting me on the line as well. So I'm going to do it. You yourself should do the same thing. Going to On the other side of that, when you start looking at the vendor stuff and getting them what their requirements are, the big thing I push, and they actually made it easier at the end of last year, is if I'm using a vendor that I'm, Microsoft or others that's using their tools from a SaaS standpoint, I go get their SOC report. There's a SOC 2 report that those vendors actually have to have. And if it's a financial transfer, they actually have a PCI report. They actually, by law, have to have. And before you had to get that report, it's very detailed. You had to have NDAs in place and all that. And it's a pain to do, but you can do it. The end of last year, now they have a summary report that's been blessed off legally that actually is easier to get now to get that, and it meets the requirements. So now they're telling you, we're meeting these requirements. We've been audited. It's been approved. Now let's do it. You can use that as part of your due diligence to meet your requirements of what you're asking for. But you get a copy of that and maintain that in your vendor policies. And now that helps you with those requirements.
Yeah.
You just got to know what to go ask for. Do that homework and get that based on what you're doing there.
Yeah, good thing you said SOC 2. That's a critical one, right? That's a really good example.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So they've had to do that through attestation, right? Another group,
Yep.
A licensed examiner who has come in and put them through the ringer. I have been through SOC 2 multiple times. It's not an easy process, right? It takes a lot of work to do. And so you're getting that kind of validation by an impartial judge per se, who can tell you that's been done. And so you're right. PCI is another one. HIPAA. There's a bunch of these that are great to be able to look at some of the compliance. Certification standards that give you a better idea of what the company is, what their security posture is.
So in coming into this, and we kind of look at this, and cybersecurity, everybody thinks technical and all this, but really it's a business risk that you're trying to manage. And so we go back about, the deal, do I want to deal with the devil or no deal at all? And I said, the devil I want to deal with is my budget, instead of having to worry about them out there, because it allows me to be prepared and make sure my risk is as low as it possibly can be. And so we approach this, the awareness, know what it is. That's what we're trying to bring, is awareness. What should you look at? What's going on out there? What is my requirements? And especially the obscure requirements you might not think about, because everybody's focused on the technical piece of it. The business side of it is what we're trying to illuminate here, because that's the least talked about that I hear when I talk to clients. And laying out that risk, once you got that risk, now I talked about budget, and the program started the budget. How am I going to do this? I'd rather deal with that devil right there than worry about the other one later. And then your reporting, which we talked about, and then your instant response. I mean, we're wrapping this up. So to me, one of the things we've done, you've wrote your book, No Safe Harbor. I did Exploited, which, by the way, anybody that books a discovery call with me is going to get a signed copy of both Mark's book and my book. So we hope you sign up to a discovery call. You can actually click in your window there. But if you take these pillars and think about from the business, like we sat down and talked about, what is it I have to get operational at a minimum subset.
Mhm.
Define it. Because when you define that, you're lowering the risk. Now I know what to budget for. I know what to report on, and I know how to handle it when the time comes. This is part of my team. We talk about this every quarter. Is there anything we got to tweak? Is there anything we need to do? We run through it. If we take out this system, what happens? Everybody should be doing that. You know, a lot of people do it once a year. That's getting now where that's not flying. I'm seeing where I'm being asked to generate compliance reports quarterly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in this, from your perspective, is there, out this setup, is there anything there that's not here that you think someone needs to focus on? That's that one of those obscure things that you just don't talk about all the time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, these sort of five really come from a bunch of different tools, right? The
Mm-hmm.
CISA essentials that they have,
Yep.
and other frameworks like NIST and CIS and so on. And in fact, the one I'd mentioned there is the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors, is a handbook on cyber risk, and it's for fiduciary officers, the company, and board members. And the nice thing for technical people is it's a doc to share with your executive or for the execs to learn. At the end of the day, for them to learn what fiduciary care, what their legal obligations look like when it comes to cybersecurity risk. And I think that's one of the big things. That's the gap here, is that often the executive doesn't understand it, right? They don't understand, and they see it in terms of budget request. And, I don't want to say, say the chicken little, the sky is falling, but often it's sort of like, well, look, you're trying to build a use case or a buy case around fear, right? We call it FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Yep.
And then that's going to drive whatever it is technology that you want to purchase. And, you got to get them out of that mindset and flip it around to like, okay, so what's the business? Like Wayne said, what are the core elements to this business that truly matter? So what are our real assets, not just in terms of data? And then now that I understand that, I know what our objectives are. These are the core things I got to protect. Now, from a technology and a security perspective, now I can go build a program that focuses on those. And where we got risk that we have to accept, we know we've accepted it. Where we have risk we thought we mitigated, then that one should be one that we can sleep at night. We don't have to worry about. And, do we have the right insurance? Do you have all those layers of protection in place? And I think that's the big thing, is that, a lot of times it's this uphill battle of, people think you're selling fear and you're not. You're selling reality. The challenge is, how do you change it? And I think that's if I boil that down, the real trick is getting out of the ones and zeros and getting into the dollars and the cents, right? So finding your Rosetta Stone that's going to translate that for you. So when you say something, when you talk about this, it resonates with the non-technical executives, the CFO, the COO, the CEO, the board members, the chairman, because at the end of the day, they're the ones with the purse strings, right? And at the end of the day too, when things blow up, they're going to be the ones dealing with it.
And it's kind of like we, in our first webinar, just talking about is, hey, this is scary stuff. And yeah, it can come across as we're trying to create that fear, uncertainty, doubt, but it's not. We're trying to educate. And that's what I want to do, is educate folks, is take something scary and make it manageable.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to attack it. If you go attack it, then you can take the actual fear out, because you're minimizing the risk, because you're putting things in place, because the risk is the fear, right? So put things in place. Don't be afraid of it. And if you don't know, and believe me, I'm learning every day, because all this stuff changes. You always got to be educating yourself. And that was the whole premise of what we wanted, how we want to do these webinar series, to go do this. So next week, we'll actually be talking about how we together, AvTek as well as Adlumin, and what we do to address these requirements from very specific pieces, because there's multiple different areas you go do, but we're going to do this. And again, for those that sign up those discovery call, you'll be getting a signed copy of my book, Exploited, as well as Mark's No Safe Harbor. Mark, as usual, this was extremely fun again. And I'm looking forward to next week, because next week we actually get to talk about how we actually do things. And to me, that's the fun part, and relate them back to the requirements, because you got to understand how the technology, and how not just technology, but documentation applies to which requirements. because there's no one silver bullet.
No.
It's a layered approach. I always talk about it. It is from the very entry to all the way back to HR's bringing on a new hire. What are the policies they need to be aware of, read, and sign? All that's part of the requirements, because like cyber insurance, they ask for those policies. Did you, what's your bring your own device policy? What is, those various different things, because all those are risk points for the business. So that's what we're going to get into next week, and that's going to be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, right? Because we've set the stage here. We've talked about, I think, kind of two of those pillars of risk, right, or two corners of the risk. We've talked about the threats and the bad guys, and now we've talked about the compliance accounting part. Now the next part is like, let's solve the problem, because it is solvable. This isn't about trying to pretend you're a big bank to protect yourself. There's lots of opportunities, a lot of fundamentals you're going to put in place, and that's the approach we take. Right? Is back to align it to the organization, what matters to them, and the business's objectives. And so this is like a bit like that 5-pillar framework around business risk or cyber risk as a business issue. Same thing. That's how we're going to deal with cybersecurity. And it's always, Wayne, it's always a pleasure working with you, right? So
I enjoyed it. And I hope everybody had, got something out of this. Also, if you want to see this, you'll be able to come back in and see this, because it's recorded up on our platform. You'll be able to come back to it and visit it anytime. And hopefully you'll be with us next week when we wrap up with that. We actually do this. So Mark, till next week, and everybody else, have a good one.